I'm going to vamp a little bit until we make sure that everybody's here. I'll just mention that we're going to do this again next month, but we're not sure who's speaking yet. So stay tuned. Look, it may be in the Argus. Check your email or look at the website. All right. All right. Hello. I'm Charles C. Kaler, President of the League of Women Voters of Lane County. Welcome to our speaker series brought to you on third Thursdays. We come to you virtually with the help of Rhonda Livesay, Terry Parker, and Nancy Mills. Thank you to you three who are helping so well. We live on the traditional land of the Canopy people, whose descendants are citizens of both the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde community and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. We honor the land and the people who have cared for it and reaffirm our commitment to steward and honor the land through our League's work. After our League's presentation, we'll have time for some questions, and you can begin to ask now as they come to mind via Q&A, and we'll save them for later. Our esteemed speaker today is Karen Knudsen, who, after attaining a master's degree in architecture from the U of O, went to work as a planning specialist and project designer for a local architectural firm. She works at the university's College of Design Department of Architecture and Planning in the design studio as an instructor and assistant professor. Whoops. Okay. As a member of the Architecture Foundation of Oregon, she is their board of directors co-chair of civic engagement. And 5 years ago, she became the principal and partner at Larco Knudsen. In 2020, she received the Eugene City Club's Turtle Award, given to community citizens for sticking their necks out. She embodies the City Club's award criteria of creative problem solving, stimulating constructive action, forging relationships, and valuing diverse perspectives. Karen lives in Eugene with her husband and 2 daughters. Okay, wow. I'm sure I've forgotten or left out some of your amazing accomplishments. The League has partnered with Better Housing Together to help us understand housing needs and to assist with solutions. I'm pleased and honored to introduce its board member and founding director, Karen Knudsen. Thanks for talking with us, Karen.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Chelsea, for that very generous introduction and your kind words. Also, thank you to Rhonda and Nancy and Terry for putting this together. It takes effort to continue to have our community conversations and to gather in these unique and challenging times. And I really appreciate it. And I'm supporter of the League's work and just delighted that, that I'm able to be here with you all today. I am going to share my screen, and that just happens just seamlessly, beautifully, thanks to the efforts of those folks just mentioned. Let's see here. Did that work? There we go. Try that one more time. I think I shared the wrong thing. And I, as is my habit, certainly as someone who teaches in architecture and planning at the University of Oregon, I'm going to try to share with you a lot of information today. There's a lot going on related to housing in our community and enormous number of entry points that we could take into this conversation. Specifically today, I'm going to be talking a lot about housing diversity and specifically the middle housing work that is underway really across Oregon, but certainly our local efforts, Eugene, Springfield, Lane County efforts are most immediately relevant to this conversation. And I'll try to share with you a whole bunch of information, context, history, where we're at, what this process has been like to date, where it's headed, Better Housing Together's work in advocating for increasing housing affordability, diversity, and supply over the last 5 years now. And then we'll have time to discuss and some Q&A at the end. So I'm going to, go quickly, but anything that you want to chat more about, please drop that message into the chat or bring it up in questions. So just very briefly, because this was mentioned and it matters so much to me and so much to our organization, the partnerships that we have built across this community. Better Housing Together is an independent 501c3 housing advocacy organization, but we are also the hub of what is a collective impact effort with 50 partners across our county, across sectors, and with carrying a very wide range of diverse interests and missions to this work. But our work together and our commitment together is to work collaboratively with our partners to increase housing affordability, diversity, and supply in Lane County. And when people talk about being a partner in Better Housing Together's work, really what they're talking about is making that commitment to working on solutions collaboratively together that increase housing affordability, diversity, and supply. Those three things, we need them all together in order to address the significant housing crisis that we face. And we are really proud to be doing this work and to be doing this work with so many extraordinary partners with deep local roots, like the League of Women Voters of Lane County and many others who you see on this wonderful wheel in front of you. I wanted to take a moment to highlight that, hearkening back to 2017 and 2018, when we publicly launched this work, this project to be thinking more collaboratively and collectively about our housing needs, that the League has been with us in that discussion really since the beginning and helping to frame, offer context, engage and do outreach, to your networks and into the community. And that has been so important for all of us in understanding the field position that we have, the reality of the challenge that we're facing, how complex and structural that it is, and giving us a shared foundation and a shared collection of facts that we can proceed from in order to make meaningful steps and have the actions that we take be productive and help us to address something that it's going to take a long time for us to fully feel like we've gotten our arms around. This infographic on the left side of the screen, I just want to mention these two halves. On the right side, you see Pat Hawken, of course, from the League of Women Voters, and Richie Weinman as two just still snapshots from a video that we made to talk about Lane County's housing crisis. And this is available on betterhousingtogether.org if you want to watch it. On the left side is an infographic that we prepared for our first large community event in early 2018 when we were launching this project. And what was really important in putting together that infographic, sharing this information, was to help people understand just how much so many people in our communities were struggling with the cost of housing, just how many people were, just barely getting by, making things work month to month, at best, week to week sometimes, and the amount of instability and harms that are generated by our current housing market, and the fact that we haven't taken meaningful steps to address it and hadn't at this time. This graphic was to help people understand just what the cost of living is now. And this, as reference, is a snapshot from American Community Survey and data from late 2017, early 2018. So these numbers in many ways have gotten worse as you know what's happened with our housing market in the last 5 years, even with a better sense of the challenges we're facing. But really important when initiating this work in community to help people understand that, earning $60,000 in Eugene or $57,900 in Eugene doesn't mean a household is sitting pretty. Right? It doesn't mean that household is pulling in as much money as they need to feel stable and plan for their future and make investments in their education or work or health. It really means that they're just barely getting by. This is data from, again, combining our census data with the Alice report from United Way of Lane County, another partner in our effort, just to help people understand how, when looking in our community by quintile, how the basic budget survival lines up to incomes, and understanding that really for about 80% of our community, right, people are struggling. The high cost of housing is the primary driver of that struggle. And just as an aside, the numbers included in this graph, these points of data, they include 0 assumptions of medical debt and 0 assumptions of educational debt. And any household carrying either one of those things knows that those fixed costs are not something that can be ignored. So we have been trying to do this work over the last 5 years to bring people together, to gather all sorts of inputs to orient and shape and direct our actions and community outreach work. Some of these are cards and data points we collected from our first large public event, which really was used to lay out the next 2.5 years of advocacy and outreach. We also are very fortunate to partner with the University of Oregon's Housing Design Program. And that's a great opportunity that we just have locally, being in a community with our state's flagship higher educational institution. And we have tried to continually be present and to host events, to host outreach and conversations that allow us to reach across presumed divisions, and also to dig into more detail as we're thinking about why certain housing policies might matter, why certain changes might be so important. Why certain changes are so important and why we really need to be working on these issues on housing affordability, diversity, and supply is because it's pretty easy to find Lane County when you're looking across the country and trying to understand what percentage of local households are cost burdened by their housing. To be housing cost burdened means you're paying more than 30% of your income for your housing costs alone. To be severely cost burdened is more than 50% of your income to housing alone. And there is Lane County, more than 40%, bright red over on the West Coast. Looking at this challenge from another angle, you could consider the average price to income ratio by metro area. Once again, we are far out of reach of what would be affordable. What this data means, price to income ratio, what this is talking about is the number of years of your annual income that you might need in order to afford what would be a median priced home. Of course, the greater the ratio, the less affordability that is available. This number used to be understood to be something that a healthy, sort of balanced housing market would want to be around 3 years, right? 3 years of income, total income to be able to afford the price of a house. You can do that quick math yourselves or for your family members who you're thinking about. And in our community, we are now cresting towards 7 and 8 in that ratio, which makes saving for with our high costs of rent and attaining housing based on income essentially impossible. It's something that we are not providing as an option within our community anymore. Looking at this in yet another way and connecting housing price to market realities, the current cost or 2019 costs, these have continued to increase, of a 2-bedroom rental would require someone to earn $22.97, $23 an hour in Oregon to afford. That translates at our current minimum wage to 81 hours of work every week, all weeks of the year, in order to afford an average 2-bedroom apartment in our community. Again, not attainable. And the yet another facet to this in thinking about supply, right? And how it is that we are meeting our needs, right? And working to address housing needs through what we produce with our policies and with our building culture and our industry. Over the last, really since 2010, we have been underbuilding on average every year. And that creates significant compression, pressure, and strain on a market that already was putting that pressure and that strain on its middle income, low income, very low income, vulnerable populations. And it's something that our housing policy can work to address. I want to pause here briefly and just make a specific an emphatic point, because also so much of our housing policy conversation tends to focus also on the crisis of homelessness. You can't be in our community and not be aware of the challenges that so many people in our community are facing, the harms and the cascading impacts of that circumstance. And one thing that has been really interesting, and I shared this information when speaking at the Human Rights Commission screening of The Invisible Class, which is a film I would encourage everyone who's watching and listening to see, is that, if you're looking at the cause of homelessness in a regional or citywide condition, the data points that explain that are high rents and low vacancy, right? That rent is high, unattainable, out of reach for people, and that when they can't reach that rent, there are no other options available to them. Those two issues, not drug use, not mental illness, not rates of generosity or philanthropy or poverty within a community, those two issues are, when you look at the data, explain regional and citywide variations on homelessness. And if you want to see that in a couple of different charts and feel not very good about where we are in terms of our rental rates and how that drives the condition of homelessness, there's Eugene, way up there with our mean market rent now at $1,200 per month. And there we are again at the very top and off the chart with our vacancy rates at just 2% in 2019. And vacancy rates are tricky to track because of all sorts of variations in that process and timeline. But what you can absolutely take away from this data is that we do not have enough housing available at an enormous number of price points that the people in our community need. So we face a structural housing crisis. It creates widespread instability, not just related to housing, but to all sorts of other goals like graduation rates and education attainment and opportunities economically and in jobs, small businesses, all sorts of things. Widespread instability and measurable harms, plural, in our community. And ignoring that painful and sometimes shaming reality, right? No one wants to think that, we have intentionally built a place that is failing to meet the needs of so many. And that is, that's hard. But ignoring that difficulty and ignoring that painful reality will not help us to address our needs today or in the future. What we need to focus on and to work towards continuously are real solutions that increase housing affordability, diversity, and supply throughout our community. But the really good news is that while this is change and change is difficult, sometimes scary for people, we can do this work and we know how to do this work. One of the ways that we are going to do that work is by increasing the housing diversity and the range of options available throughout our community and across Oregon as a result of a piece of legislation passed in 2019, House Bill 2001. Many of you are well aware of this, but Better Housing Together was among many statewide advocates and quite a diverse range of advocates who were working towards and asking for our state to lead in this effort. Because unfortunately, what was very clear is that we weren't getting that done locally and through the typical avenues and policies and timelines that are available. So in thinking about missing middle housing or middle housing, what's been missing from housing? So, connecting some of those dots. Mid-size has been missing, right? Smaller units, which certainly is a different cost and also supports a different household type and lifestyle. Mid-cost, so mid-market housing or workforce housing, right, is not something that we've been focusing production on as we've been undersupplying. When undersupply is occurring in a market, that means that most of the supply is coming in at the very highest price point, right? If you think about those dynamics and how industries work. So we have not been creating a space in our regulatory framework for more mid-market, mid-cost workforce housing. We haven't been thinking about housing that is for people who are not midlife, right? We still are thinking about often the single family home with 3 bedrooms or 4 bedrooms for a couple, heterosexual normed and, a couple of children. And that is really not the diversity of community and the diversity of households that we are now locally. There's barely a third of our community that has children at home. So housing that is for something other than that family with children at home is incredibly important, right? Different ages, different lifestyles, and certainly different costs and price points that come with it. And then lastly, livability, right? In thinking about a pattern of housing development, access and connectivity, walkability, being able to reach transit, and to be able to have neighborhood centers and things that you can walk to, incredibly important, right? And a fun part of being in a community like ours. We all know those places that we experience and love. I mentioned briefly a few moments ago that this work was going to mean change. And what I want to put a really fine point on that, because it is also related to some of the headwinds that this work faces. In that when we need to change something in policy, it is very easy for, in some cases, just a single voice, or maybe just 2 voices or 3 voices, to identify what it is that is changing, and then present that change as something that people should be afraid of, or that people should be angry about, or that doesn't actually serve our community's needs. And in 2019, at the same time as the legislature was working on middle housing laws, Eugene was in the process of doing a code audit. And what this code audit found, if you just look at the graph in front of you, is that our current code really only allowed for a handful of things in a few places, right? When you're thinking about housing diversity and looking at, so where in 2019 did we allow ADUs? Where did we allow small lot detached housing or cluster cottages, row houses, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, courtyard apartments? These are all traditional housing types. They used to be very common. What we found, what the analysis of this work found, is that we were allowing those to exist almost nowhere. And so not surprisingly, we have gotten almost none of them. And the middle housing that we have now is not the result of recent, meaning like the last 20 or 30 years of local planning or special area zone planning. That middle housing has persisted over generations. It was built in the early 20th century before we made it illegal. And that's why those wonderfully diverse neighborhoods exist, because that housing was allowed to be built, and then it was. And it has served, dozens of households likely during its tenure. The takeaway here is that we have to change if we want more housing diversity, if we want more housing affordability, if we want more opportunity for different people to find their footing in our community, and that barriers have abounded in our current code. How did we get here? You could, consider that in some ways opposition to housing solutions can be, a hyper localized phenomenon. And there's a lot of research and data around this, right? Like nobody notices things changing in a community the way that the person living right next door to that change experiences it or sees it, right? But the context that creates housing instability, and housing opportunity is cultural, and is something that is across many layers of regulatory structure and societal and public opinion. And so thinking a little bit about how we got here is kind of important. We have to go back to Victorian London in the late 19th century and looking at the extraordinarily challenging, unhealthy housing circumstance that existed at that point in time. And then notice that as a result of becoming aware of this uncaring, inhumane, unhealthy condition that so many within the community were experiencing, theorists, began to imagine other choices, other ways of designing our community. And so the Garden Cities concept by Ebenezer Howard grew out of this idea that we could use wide open spaces and organize all of these components of our community, in certain areas of space and certain amounts of population. And that would just be how we would occupy the landscape. It's a very idyllic vision. Jumping across the pond to the United States in the late 19th century, New York, progressive era housing reform was also born out of the same social awareness, right? Community awareness that, and largely thanks to the photography of the photojournalist Jacob Riis, whose book, How the Other Half Lives, probably many of you have heard of, that when more people were aware of just how dark and unsupported and medieval in many conditions, right? At this point, a lot of housing, was not much different than what had existed in medieval times, that we needed to make some changes. And so there were other ideas about what that might look like here. And Clarence Perry's neighborhood unit in 1929, looking at the idea of a community center at the core of a neighborhood and a certain amount of space and all the traffic pushed to the arterials at the edges, and really focusing on an experience of, again, an idyllic neighborhood cell. And helpful and interesting theory, and something that we saw then replicated across the landscape, beginning with the Radburn City Plan in 1929 and proliferating across many communities, right? This is the beginning of a suburban-oriented development pattern. Critical for us to understand, acknowledge, and learn from the fact that that pattern of idyllic lifestyle was not made uniformly available within our country and to the residents, the people who are here. The redlining maps, the Hulk maps of late 1930s into the 40s, the residential securities maps. I think you all are probably aware of these, or also know the book, The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein, fantastic book if you want to understand the ways in which discrimination has persisted in our housing policy since these times. In early mid 20th century. But what these red lines maps did was focus investments to white neighborhoods and higher income neighborhoods, identify areas that were Black or immigrant communities, communities of color, some cases just poor communities, as hazardous or dangerous, and not allow investments or access to more affordable mortgages in those areas. And this is the way in which we disinvested really in everyone who didn't fit within an idea of a white American vision of housing stability and access. And that is something that also these current laws are working to change. So I mentioned the suburban development pattern, 1939, Levittown, Pennsylvania. By the mid 1950s, we have the Interstate Highway Bill, and we're thinking a lot about high-speed movement and flying through communities and connecting our cities and hubs. And we very quickly see a development pattern that carries forward some of those idyllic concepts of the neighborhood unit, or even from parts of garden cities, pushes, high-speed traffic to the edges, removes a lot of the connectivity, but is a homogeneous solution in its first installation, right? And that if not allowed to evolve, would remain homogeneous and really targeting to a particular demographic, a particular household type, a particular income level, and not really serving many other people. This is a slide that I added after making a short presentation at that screening of the Invisible Class, because someone watching the presentation said, it strikes me that you have not connected the final dot, which is, where are we now with what our housing policies have generated? And how can this be a moment of inflection in thinking about change? So the image on the left is a slide from the Invisible Class that's from one of the waterways in LA. The image on the right is actually from a late 2021 NPR article. This is just a working class individual wondering why it is that there are no housing options available for them. That there are big options in buildings and big options in single family homes, and really nothing for the workforce. And these conditions and the points that these two, this film and this article are raising, are connected. We have not been building the housing that we need for so many people. So how can middle housing options help? They can help by connecting the dots. Across the top of this slide is a housing affordability framework that we built as a part of Lane County's first affordable housing action plan that Better Housing Together worked on through 2019 and 2020, was adopted in December of 2020. This helps us understand annual incomes at different occupational groups, what monthly affordable housing costs might be for those occupational groups based on looking for that 30% or less metric, how that connects to median family income for a 3-person household, because that's a data point that capital A, capital H affordable housing is often looking at, and what that might mean in terms of affordable home ownership costs, right? Like, what might a monthly mortgage be, and what might the cost of a home need to be in order to be affordable at that amount. And then lastly, at the size of the home point, a few notes like, okay, well, if we want to create more housing that is affordable at a lower price point in the 20th century, when we have diminishing access to some natural resources, we want to pay people livable wages for their work. How do we think about the size of the housing that could be constructed to meet that point, right? So in these sort of vertical slices. And then across the bottom, Dan Perolic from Opticos designs now, I think, very well-known diagram of missing middle housing, which stretches across a whole range of housing types. Current supply of housing, that orange arrow on the right, way off these charts, right? Like, we're not building new, large single family homes that meet the needs of this very wide range of households and occupational groups. But we could be. What that little dash line below now shifted to is the lower kind of 4 typologies that are included in House Bill 2001, the duplex, the triplex, fourplex, courtyard cottages, and row housing. And that when we think about how it is that could be important, we should be really encouraged, because the economic analysis that Eco Northwest did for the city of Eugene found that by steering opportunity towards the supply of these smaller infill, more attainable housing units, that we would actually get to the price points that we need in our community. Now that has other benefits beyond just the individual household. When we are creating the opportunity to have this balance, we can better utilize our land. We have a wider mix of housing units within every neighborhood, right, within across the community, which is sort of built-in resilience. And we share the cost of infrastructure, right, across many more households, which is really important because infrastructure is expensive and we are going to need to continuously reinvest in what we have built. Smaller housing also costs less to maintain, less to heat and cool, pollutes less over its lifetime. 80% plus of the energy used by housing is used in its operation, not in its construction or deconstruction. So having new housing that is energy efficient by design and then also more affordable by design is climate conscious. This is why we say housing policy is climate policy. And this data point is from the Sightline Institute. And then we also need to steer, right? We need to steer more supply of our housing towards the diversity of households that we have. This is a graph from Eco Northwest showing the housing mix at Oregon, in Oregon at these different decade snapshot points. And what you can see is that we've been building about 3/4 single family housing or more, and a little bit less than 1/4 multifamily housing for quite some time. And there is nothing in demographic analysis looking forward that would say, that's just right. You've got just the right mix for what you need. What this tells us is that we have a lot of supply of something that will always be in demand and will always be a fabric of our community, right? Plus 90%, more than 90% of our land has been planned, and utilized for single family housing. It is centuries of work for that fabric to change, but we need to start doing that work. And when we're thinking about what will happen in 2022, 2023, and beyond, economists and our lawmakers locally, regionally, at the county, at the state, are looking at our housing needs. They're required to do that because of House Bill 2003. And what they can also see is that we are underproducing across all the different ways that we could model this, the low, medium, and high implications, but we are underproducing in every one of our income brackets. And that is not a good thing. If we want to address housing discrimination, expand opportunity, expand the path to homeownership, and address the racial wealth gap, which is primarily driven by the question of whether or not a person owns or does not own their housing, we have to take these steps. This is the upper half of an infographic we built working with several community partners last fall to help people understand that housing discrimination persists and the implications of it persist now and for generations going forward. Of course, not surprising to those of you who own your home and have watched it increase in value 10, 20% almost last year on the year, homeowners have 40 times the net worth of renters. But when you look also at our cross-section of who homeowners are, you see that white households, and this goes back to those early 20th century decisions, and many others since then, have had much more opportunity to access housing and also build on the asset of housing, right? And that if you are never able to get a foot into the housing market, it is very difficult for you to build intergenerational wealth. And we know that. We also know, for anyone who might say, no, we addressed all of the housing stuff, with the Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights era. We did that work. It was good and we did it. I would say, well, but no, we have more work to do. The data tells us that, but we also know that in our hearts and in talking with our friends. The rate of homeownership has changed almost none for most households since that mid-century. In Lane County, our Black neighbors have only a 28% rate of homeownership. And it's no surprise when you think about the fact that we haven't actually changed the types of housing that we are making available to people, right? So this is why ending exclusionary zoning and expanding housing options and housing diversity in all areas is at the top of every racial justice, housing justice, equitable development strategy that you will find from reputable organizations and advocacy groups across the country. And, and this is what it looks like in the end, not surprisingly, a lot like what we already know, right? Neighborhood options that are actually traditional housing options. These are not giant looming apartment buildings. These are not towering structures. Walking around in your community, in your neighborhood, you can probably see existing buildings and structures, that already reflect what would be an outcome of House Bill 2001. And that, in the future might be walking down a street like 12th Avenue or near Olive and seeing a whole diversity of housing options on one street, and knowing that, in fact, this is part of a community and makes us a stronger community. To share more of this other background and information, if you want, or thinking about your other networks, we made a short movie talking about some of these issues. It's available on Better Housing Together's website and also on our Facebook page. So please feel free to grab that and use it. Quickly, going to share, so how are we doing, right? Like, what has been happening? And the way that Eugene and Springfield, I'll talk a lot about Eugene's work, have tackled the middle housing work, are different, certainly, in how the two communities have approached it. In Eugene, it has been a very intensive process and has piloted some new ways of working and engaging in our community that we have never done, which is pretty exciting. This summary of outreach is pulled from the city's website. It was, is accurate up to last summer. So there's been quite a lot of additional engagement through the fall, and a planning commission public hearing that was held in November that had very strong advocacy and support. I'll make sure to share the link to that afterwards. But I wanted to be sure to put this on the screen and highlight a few things, especially this Healthy Democracy panel that was convened to actually represent, in a group of people, the diversity of our community. Meaning that the process that was in place, and then the engagement with this group of people over many months period of time, was designed to have representation in the room that reflects us accurately, at least through one measure. And that is not what we usually have. Usually we have public processes because they are more easily accessed by people who have time, right? By people who have resources, who have flexibility to attend a meeting in the evening, who have access to childcare to, leave their kids and go give a public comment, or to even just follow some of these details really carefully. And that means that our processes often hear most from that perspective, and not very much from the vast majority of the community that really doesn't have time to think about this crisis, but they experience the housing crisis every day. And you can learn more about that. From the survey that the city put together, what they heard was that 82% of the general public engaging with that survey wanted to do more than the minimum required by this law, wanted the city to encourage and to incentivize more middle housing production in our community. Springfield heard something very similar in their survey outreach, that 70%, or just more than 70%, also wanted for the city to do more, to encourage and, in their terms, maximize. Eugene is using the term incentivize, but to incentivize or maximize outcomes, because in both cases, these communities know that it is actually hard to get housing built. It is challenging. Better Housing Together also did some outreach at the beginning of 2021 to understand this context. We put together a poll working with some of our partners, and reached out to 500 self-identified voters and adults through that poll. But what we heard from that was resounding and clear. More than 3/4 think that both the cost of housing is too high to buy and the cost of rent is too high. 8 out of 10 people supporting Oregon's new middle housing policies, right? Aware of them and also supporting them. 3/4 of people polled supporting backyard cottages, garage apartments, small houses, and it being really clear to them that our zoning needs to change, because working families, young people who can't find a foothold in the community, and low-income households who are struggling to access stable housing are all being pushed out. And this is a major quality of life issue, and people see it and they care about it in the same way that they care about crime and schools. So 8 out of 10 people across ownership, rental housing, all sorts of perspectives supporting this work. And when we shared that information in a postcard that we sent last spring, and gave people an unstamped postcard and said, hey, here are some things that would also incentivize middle housing if we said we wanted to see more of this. These are things that could do that. If you feel this way, put a stamp on this, sign your name, print your name, add whatever you would like. And 573 people returned those postcards to our city councilors and mayor. So we know that there is a lot of support across the community to encourage and incentivize more of these outcomes. What that looks like on the ground, and again, going back to some of those earlier slides, is creating a regulatory context that is more supportive of housing creation, right? Like having minimum lot sizes that are not so large that it wouldn't matter what size of house you put on it, it would still be impossible, to achieve any measure of affordability or equity in that work. But looking towards proposed minimum lot sizes of 4,500 square feet is what we require for a single family home. For fourplexes and cottage clusters, that would be the same. And for duplexes and triplexes, that would be smaller townhouses. It's not applicable because of the way that those lots are addressed with townhouses and a shared wall and a lot line. And also, oh yes. Sorry.
Can you wrap this up? Oh, we've got questions. And
oh, good. Okay. I'll just say a couple more things about where we're at, and then I'll leave the last slides, and maybe some of that will come up in discussion.
Very good. Thank you.
The one other thing that this table helps us to share, and if you all are interested, you can of course dig through this information on the city's websites or through our planning commission meetings. But important to understand that there's proposal in the works to say, if we want to prioritize smaller housing units, we will actually let the lots also be smaller, which makes sense, right? When you're thinking about scale of unit to lot size, but that would be a way to prioritize more affordability and more feasibility with our infill. Building heights and proposed maximum heights, fairly straightforward across the board, and nothing particularly exciting to report here, though I have heard some community angst that I think has been just whipped up by a couple of people. When thinking about the heights of our buildings and also then the roof structures of our buildings, there's more than one measurement in play. But what you could be thinking about in the case of these proposed maximum heights is that these would be very typical heights for these housing types. So if you are a person who's interested in housing typologies, you could learn just by looking at that. I'll show a couple of pictures of what these standards look like through the city's representation. Don't know if architect necessarily was involved in drawing these, probably was, but to help people understand what a duplex would look like, given the standards that are in place, what a triplex could look like. A triplex could look like a lot of things. What a fourplex might look like. I think this is actually a very unlikely version of a fourplex. I think the version on the left is much more likely as an outcome, certainly much more desirable as a housing form to my view. And then a cottage cluster representation, which is looking at the sort of maximum buildable envelope. Cottage clusters tend to be small. They're designed to be, typically, 1 to 2 stories in height and oriented around a shared open space. And then townhouse standards that really probably the simplest thing to do is to show these two examples, neither of which were constructed using the House Bill 2001 laws. Lots of information about parking that comes up in conversations about middle housing. The takeaway that I think is important for you all, but I'm happy to talk more about it, is that we should really be prioritizing housing with our infill efforts and efforts to diversify the housing types within our neighborhoods. We should not be prioritizing new areas of asphalt off street, especially. That is the way that we lose our tree canopy provided, from within privately owned parcels, and also we lose street trees every time we add a curb cut. So really important from our perspective to not prioritize parking over trees. Typically that is a kind of commonly understood obstruction tactic used when people are trying to drive feasibility down or make housing geometrically impossible. Last, a quick note, because people ask about this. Senate Bill 458 also addressed the issue of creating ownership lots from middle housing. Like, how can we have middle housing that's not only rental housing? We need rental middle housing, but we also would love to have ownership middle housing. And Senate Bill 458 created a path that would make that expedient and straightforward. And this diagram shows how that land division would be possible with the unit still meeting all of these requirements. So what's most important, and I'll stop here and then open it up for questions. It's important that we understand that the purpose of House Bill 2001 is to create new and more diverse housing options in Oregon's neighborhoods, in Eugene's neighborhoods, in Springfield's neighborhoods. It is a key necessary step in addressing our history of exclusion and housing discrimination in the state. It absolutely means that our neighborhoods over time, and quite slowly because the building culture is very slow, but it means that our neighborhoods will gain housing options over time. And that is really good news as we become more and more diverse as a community. Our housing supply overall will become more diverse, which is an aspect of resilience, again, very important. And smaller households and households without children will have options better suited to their needs. Low-income households will have a path to homeownership that is feasible. We currently have none for them. Renters will have more options both to own and to rent. And critically, and I hope there are some questions about this, we really need new housing solutions and new housing policies to address the displacement and the instability that is happening right now. This law is not yet in effect. Displacement and housing instability are happening. What we are doing is not working. It is not preventing those challenges from being within our community. And it is necessary for us to bring new solutions to the table if we are serious about those concerns. So when people bring up issues of displacement or housing justice, and then seek to tie that into a package that includes advancing exclusionary zoning and carving out certain neighborhoods from having to participate in this slow incremental process to diversify, those are not consistent positions. And I'm happy to talk more about this as we get into the Q&A. So I'll stop there.
Very good. I learned stuff, and I'm on a planning commission. So thank you very much for your presentation. The Lee has been working with this and pretty sophisticated. So we've got some questions, and we if it's okay with you, we may go over the 1 hour limitation a bit.
I need to stay with you all because I think I ran long. So please fire away.
Okay. And one of the first questions we got was, do y'all work with citizen transportation planning organizations or government bodies to be sure that housing development and transportation infrastructure go hand in hand?
I love this question. Thank you, whomever asked it. Absolutely, we do. I can begin by saying that Better Eugene Springfield Transportation is one of Better Housing Together's longest partners in this work. When we first began as a project that hadn't yet applied for any grants or figured a path forward, Better Eugene Springfield Transportation was so kind and thoughtful as to fiscally sponsor our efforts. So we are absolutely engaged in that work. Most recently, and I would say for everyone on this conversation and call, I offered testimony to our metro planning organization, thinking about our regional transportation plan and this next 20 years of investments. And it is incredibly important that we think about how our infrastructure investments lead our development and also close the gaps and address deficiencies, lack of safety, underinvestment that has persisted in certain areas of our community for decades. And so these two things are, of course, absolutely connected. And it's really important as we're thinking about housing diversity and affordability that we are also thinking about ways to remove the cost of required personal vehicle ownership from households. That doesn't mean that people aren't still going to own cars or want to own a personal vehicle. But if you have two people working in a household, which the data would show you're going to need if you're trying to access housing here, at least two, you are likely then also needing two vehicles. And for every vehicle that you require a household to own, you're talking about $9,000 or $10,000 of additional cost subtracted from their income every year, simply because they can't access their daily needs, necessary needs with other options. So investing in transit, investing in active transportation infrastructure, pedestrian improvements, safe streets, bicycle infrastructure, absolutely necessary as we're doing this work.
Okay, thank you. Are you aware of any community land trusts being formed to create options for home ownership?
I am. These are fantastic questions because you're letting me share what was the next slide.
Oh, okay.
So yes, and the first place that you will want to look with that question are really two places. And remembering that House Bill 2001 is not yet in effect. It will go into effect really in July of 2022. But we do have organizations that have been working with community land trusts and with cooperative or limited equity cooperative models for a number of years. The most recent that, of course, we are really excited about, both our Better Housing Together's partners, is work by Square One Villages and Cultivate, Dylan Lamar's development work, the C Street Co-op in Springfield. This is a single residence on the front of the house and an ADU in the back. That also is a really creative way of thinking about how we might expand the utility of that into something that serves more households. So it's akin to a house hack, but could be a very common outcome as House Bill 2001 goes into effect. And then, of course, Dev Northwest, who's been doing fantastic work in our community as NEDCO for a number of years now, Dev Northwest, and they have been working on land trusts all around our metro area. They have not done as many in Eugene because we have had such an obstructionist stance towards infill housing. I'm paraphrasing, a lot of information, but it's really hard when our regulatory structure forces nonprofit and mission-driven organizations into very risky work and into work where they're going to get beaten up in a public discourse. We shouldn't be doing that. And I think that we will see more housing solutions by our affordable housing development partners as we create a more stable regulatory environment for them to participate in.
One of the things I think frightens people about these changes comes up in this question, and it's about mature trees and the fear of affecting that. And the other is that people will be forced to put more than one residence on a lot, that they won't be able to use the lot any other way, and that trees will be decimated. Could you help us with those fears?
Yes, happy to, because I also care deeply about both of those issues. So urban tree canopy, and there was a great article in the Register Guard just the other day with some updated GIS mapping of our canopy. We have a lot of work to do on that front, especially in areas in our community that have not seen redevelopment and new development that includes street tree standards, right? You think of us occupying a river valley, and forested streetscapes were not a typical condition of the river valley. They are things that we have created over time, right? People have invested in them, planted beautiful shade trees, hopefully native trees in their backyards, and appreciated them for decades. With middle housing and really with any infill housing challenge, the biggest threat to trees is a lack of flexibility in siting and requirements to develop parking on a site off street, because areas of asphalt, tarmacs of asphalt, generate runoff, but are also, not particularly friendly when you're looking at the root zone of trees. And so thinking about ways that our housing policy can encourage housing and not sort of falling into, a bit of a manufactured argument of like, it's housing versus trees. It doesn't have to be that way. We can absolutely do the work to protect our tree canopy, expand our tree canopy by investing in neighborhoods that we have not invested in and are much hotter every summer than what I experience, even living near where we do in South Eugene. And that's really an important part of this policy and related. There's no requirement at all that people add housing to their lots, or that they would be forced to add a housing unit instead of having a backyard garden, or add a housing unit instead of having, a heritage tree that, they can remember pushing their kids on. That's nothing a part of this law. This law simply allows for people who want to add housing units. So that might be the condition where someone is thinking about intergenerational housing and housing stability, over the next couple of decades, is able to do that. And we can protect our tree canopy at the same time, but we should absolutely not fall into a really false argument that pits our trees against housing.
Yeah. Okay. I'm getting lost in this because it's so interesting. Our people are so smart. Here's one. Is there any information locally about where low income and communities of color reside within the cities of Eugene and Springfield?
We do
Any-
have, oh, go ahead. Is there more to that question?
No, go ahead.
We do have that, some of that information, and in terms of sort of statistical numbers, and most of that comes through looking at census block data and a little bit finer grain analysis of our community. But it is in connecting to our last question, should probably come as a surprise to no one that our lower income neighborhoods and our neighborhoods that have the most diverse non-white neighbors living within them have the least access to tree cover and the least shade and the least cool generated by that resource. And that is really looking primarily at areas of our community where, again, going back into history, where we displaced a lot of our Black families too from the High Street area and from the Ferry Street community. So West Eugene, Northwest Eugene, and I will say, because again, thinking of our community in the now 21st century, we are rapidly changing place. Not in terms of the overall statistics, right? Like we, are the percentages and the percentage of our community that are white or who identify as Caucasian is still, the enormous majority. But every year we become a more diverse community, and there are more opportunities within our community, and industries have changed, and discriminatory policies across our country have changed. And with that, we are seeing more diversity in every way. And this is a really good thing because we all benefit from that change and from that opportunity. So there's more detail there, and it's fine-grained, but it's absolutely out there and can be used to be thinking about housing policy and work as well.
Okay, this is a question I don't even understand, but so I'm hoping you can help. Can you speak to the criticism about the elimination of compatibility standards and special area zones with the proposed Eugene code changes?
Yeah, first of all, going from the back, House Bill 2001 won't eliminate special area zones, but it will update housing standards to be compliant with the statutory condition, right? So if a special area zone had previously, been exclusionary in what it allowed in its housing typologies, then that would be addressed through this law. If there's a conflict, the statutory regulation will be the regulation in place. That doesn't mean that community planning or that special area zones are disappearing. It just means that we're addressing an aspect of them that has been problematic and has not generated the outcomes in our community that by any metric we want to see. They're not creating affordability, diversity, opportunity in the way that we need to be thinking about. The other piece, eliminating compatibility standards. So I'm not quite sure how to even, maybe what's underlying this question, but in thinking about the term compatibility, there's a lot to unpack there. And when thinking about housing and middle housing, what's important to remember, because I've seen some misinformation that is really inaccurate in this way, middle housing is essentially akin to single family homes in terms of its scale of development. These are traditional housing types. They exist within our community. They exist across the country. They are not new, invented now. They are things that we stopped building as we started prioritizing a really particular direction with a more suburban development pattern. And we need this housing because we need it for all of the other families that I was talking about earlier. I don't think that middle housing will be incompatible. And again, walking around some of our older neighborhoods, you can absolutely see that there is a diversity of housing, 6 units here, 1 unit there, 2 units across the street, 4 units in exactly the same housing type, but subdivided on the other side of the street, right? Those conditions already exist. So I don't think it's an issue of compatibility, but I do think that there are some messages that I've seen from at least one individual that are trying to scare people into thinking that this is going to be giant apartment buildings looming, over, a 2.5-story craftsmen, and that's not the case. I did see in the Q&A that there was a question about very large apartment buildings along Franklin Boulevard. There's nothing about that building type that is related to middle housing. Completely different construction systems, building types, underlying zoning conditions, right? Those are like our C1 most intensive development zoning. Missing middle housing is really a part of an idea of blending in and incrementally over time diversifying the fabric of more than 90% of our residential land area. Think of it as a quilting project that takes hundreds of people about 100 years to complete.
I think the other question that's come up that again is rife with rumor. There are so many, let's see if I can find it here. Areas in Eugene that have HOA or homeowner associations exempted from the requirement to allow multiple units or ADUs even. What do you think might happen with those?
Zain, it's a great question. I'm glad that someone brought up. Thank you, Sandra, who if I think I can see your name there. And I'm not an expert in contract law, and I'm also not a lawyer. I'm an architect and an urban designer, and work really in sustainability and housing. But HOA laws connect to our contract law, which for anyone following that conversation carefully knows that most of those arguments end up at the Supreme Court eventually, because we have put that type of law so close to what we consider to be foundational in our system. Interesting fact that some of the earliest Supreme Court decisions that did not allow discrimination by race related to housing were actually decided legally on the basis of contract law, not on the basis of discrimination by race being wrong, which also tells us something about where we are and our orientation, where we're going. I think what will happen over time, and there's been some discussion about this statewide, from what I understand, and I wish I was going to get these words exactly right, that HOAs are in place, but they're also a product of the people who live within them. And over time, if I were a betting person who was going to live for 200 years, and I won't live for 200 years, and I'm not a betting person, but if I were, I would bet that within a generation, HOAs will actually want the option to add housing units. They will want the option to change the pattern of development that exists within those areas. And when any process of, it's not renewing, it's another term that starts with an R, when that process of engaging the conditions of an HOA happens, middle housing laws would be in place. And that would change that conversation significantly. Anyone who lives in an HOA, you can actually petition to change the conditions of your agreements. That is possible. And I would encourage you to do that. Also I think that it is, a good example of how our housing policy work can really only push, so far at a time. And, we'll see where things go in the future.
Okay. Given that large development building is usually a cheaper method of creating greater amount of housing, why is the focus only on infill, which can be an expensive form of development? And why is Eugene urban growth boundary focused largely on industrial development instead of mixed housing?
Oh, 3 questions in one. Whoever asked that question, that was a good one. So first of all, a question about affordability and building type or construction type. It can be true that housing, attached units, shared walls, though fire separations are still necessary. So it's not just removing a wall from the condition, it's a different construction assembly. There are many cases where, building an attached unit can be a less expensive path to constructing a housing unit, but that is not always the case, largely because you need a site to build that housing on. Sites that hold larger buildings are more expensive, and certainly we're now in a very challenging condition related to land cost, and that's the highest input or the greatest input to the cost of creating housing and the price of housing. So it's true that there can be some efficiencies, but they're not, it's not like a huge jump in terms of cost efficiency, especially once you move into construction systems that are looking at anything, really over 5 stories, and you're moving into a concrete structural system or a steel structural system. Those are completely different cost models that people are working with. The focus is on middle housing for affordability is because it allows us to build small, to use infrastructure that we have already paid for and have in place, to utilize land that might actually just be sort of sitting and waiting. There are a lot of utilized backyards, filled with English ivy that people may have dreams of doing something more with than beating back the ivy every year.
And blackberries.
And blackberries. And so that's where the focus is there. And it is true, however, I want to be sure, because the person who asked this question raised this great point. Material inputs to housing at an all-time high. The impacts of climate change on costs of materials and wood, labor, and in the current boom that we have been in regionally, right? Not necessarily in Eugene, but regionally with development has made labor quite difficult. And we still have not recovered to our pre-Great Recession employment levels within the building industry locally. So I want to be sure everyone understands that that is part of our challenge. We don't have enough people working within this field locally. What is one of the reasons why we don't have that? Because those people can't afford to live here. We have a housing market that is actually unaffordable to the wage earning workers who are working within our building industry. Many people commuting into Eugene from, as far away as Albany in order to work on construction projects here. So that piece also, is quite challenging in terms of affordability. And then the last piece of this was about the urban growth boundary. Up until 5 years ago, we were stuck in a cycle of only talking about housing relative to the urban growth boundary. We were really quite focused on, if you were talking about housing, the only thing you were talking about was whether or not to expand the urban growth boundary for residential land needs. The process since our last UGB expansion and that UGB being put in place has been to track and plan for our future needs and land needs. And that process is always ongoing through the ETAC group and our growth monitoring efforts. For anyone who's interested, there are a whole bunch of technical committees that you can jump into. But that too is a part of this conversation, figuring out how we grow, when we grow, what our needs are, and really trying to steer the outcomes towards what we need. That's what all of this conversation is about. It's steering towards the outcomes we need. And when I say we need, I mean, if you have a house, if you own your home in this community, if you own it outright or have a mortgage on it that you can afford, things are going to be just fine. You're going to be okay. As you have an extraordinary asset in a beautiful place, and it is never going to diminish. The investments that come and reinvestments in our community are positive. Those are good things. We want each generation to reinvest. But we are going to need to think about how we plan for the future. And we have a lot of opportunity to do that thoughtfully with middle housing.
Okay, and I'm in Eugene, when there was consideration for the enlargement of urban growth boundary for residences, it was found that there was enough property inside to infill that would meet those demands. So we didn't need it as projected for the next 20 years. I've got 2 more questions, and I think we'll have to wrap up then. Mm-hmm. One is there an effort to work with the city of Eugene to lower development costs to allow more affordable housing? And I assume the development costs mean SDC, system development charges. I'm not sure, that wasn't particularly in the question, but is there any effort with it? Somebody's got to pay for that. How do we do that?
Yeah, so that's another great question. I do think that looking at our systems, our SDCs, our system development charges, how we adjust those relative to the type of infill that's happening, right? We were up until just a few years ago, and Better Housing Together advocated for the small house path that is now a part of some of our SDCs with EWEB and with the city to reduce that burden if you're building, a small house. Up until that point in time, we were basically assigning the same fee to an 8,000 square foot home as we were to an 800 square foot home, and just treating them the same as though they have the same impacts. And certainly you can imagine probably quite different impacts with infrastructure. So there's work to do on that front. I think that, looking across the country and even locally, there is work underway. I mean, the city of Springfield has waived their ADU SDCs for the past couple of years. When the city of Portland did that to basically jumpstart investment in the creation of those small units, they saw a significant increase in the number of units. They were then able to extend that SDC waiver over time, twice more, I believe. And in the third time, they added certain additional requirements to it. What they've seen as a result of that is two things. One, Portland now has more ADUs than any other city in the country, but two, they still only have ADUs on about 2% of the lots that would allow them, right? So it's not that the city is being overrun by ADUs, but it is production that wouldn't otherwise happen, and it's production of small housing units with no public dollars in them, which is also incredibly important when we're looking again at the breadth of the housing crisis that we have to deal with. It's incredibly important that we find ways to mobilize and steer our outcomes towards more affordability and a wider range of unit types, because we can't get there only with federal dollars for housing. We need to prioritize that funding for the people in our community who are most vulnerable and who need it the most. But that doesn't mean just ignoring the next 45% of our community and saying, well, too bad for you. You didn't get here 35 years ago when you could buy a house for $60,000.
Exactly.
Because that is a story that is real from not that long ago.
Exactly.
But we have, we can work on that. We know how to do this work.
Excellent, excellent. And I think our last question that I've heard quite a few concerns about is how will more compact development allow for solar access?
Oh gosh, good question. And it will allow for it in the same way that our current standards require that it allow for it. Again, I think this might be some of the misinformation and probably some fear mongering going around that people, there's going to be a house built on your house while you're gone, and it's all the housing that's built is going to be super expensive, and there's not going to be any affordability integrated. I think I've shared already that in fact that's not consistent with the evidence that we have, or even with the performance of our building culture already in knowing that this change is coming. So I think there's worry that this, again, walk around in a neighborhood that has a garage in the backyard. Imagine that garage is an ADU or a second dwelling unit instead. I really think you'll find, and feel free to email me if you don't find this to be the case, but I think you'll find that it's okay. And that actually when we walk around our neighborhoods, what makes them delightful to walk around is a safe and accessible sidewalk that's well maintained, street tree canopy that is mature and offers shade, some separation in distance between the sidewalk and where the travel lanes within the street are, and a whole diversity of housing. When you look at the actual fabric of our neighborhoods, it is quite diverse in terms of the character of the housing units built. We have some areas, that were built as large subdivisions 50 years ago that have a lot of similarity in terms of all the houses down the street, right? But there are other neighborhoods that are older that are quite different from lot to lot, and that's just fine. And it turns out that they also happen to love it that way. I see a couple of other questions in the Q&A or the chat that I would love to get to, and I don't know if we have time, Chelsea, but
our audience has dropped off. So I have quite a bit.
they have other things they have to get to also.
Evidently, yeah. If you're willing to answer them, go right ahead.
Sure, I'll try to catch them quickly. I think we got to Sandra. I saw your question. There's a question from Pam about the city's middle housing code proposal allowing 2 to 4 unit buildings, 75% of the lot. Okay, trying to read this quickly. So looking at a plan and doing some quick measurements, I think it's important again to separate what might look in terms of its the statistical information, the percentage information in this question as something that would be like really incompatible or unacceptable within our community's fabric, and then actually look at it in reality. And for 2 to 4 unit buildings occupying up to 75% of the lot, we have that condition in our community. We have it in many places, and some of them are really beautiful old buildings, right? Old because we built them a long time ago and they've served a purpose for a long time. Hopefully the new housing that we built will do that and then some, especially being built to current energy codes. So I'm not particularly concerned about the idea that we would allow for, you know, a triplex to occupy up to 75% of a lot. There are a lot of small houses and old small houses that occupy that much of a lot or more. And it's okay. Again, what's important is that there's other supports within our neighborhood that allow for people to walk around and be sociable and get to the park or school or their jobs or transit, and that we support those. So I think that maybe, you know, that was most of the question. We touched a little bit on trees earlier, so I won't dive into that again. But I think your question, Pam, also makes me think that Better Housing Together can do more studies to show what these contexts actually look like. And we have done a few illustrations to help people to see that. But it's going to look a lot like what some of our most interesting neighborhoods already look like, which is great. There is a question about health and affordable housing. Thank you for asking. This is absolutely in the category of cascading harms that is generated by housing instability and high cost of housing. Most people are homeless after they've been hungry and after they have not been receiving the medical care that they need for some time. So to not think that those issues are connected wouldn't be accurate. And the Alice report by the United Way is a great resource for people who are looking to understand those determinants of health and how housing stability fits into that bigger picture. There's also, let's see, no, we answered that question. Thank you, Paula. That was the 3-in-1 question. And then a comment about where new housing will be added as a result of House Bill 2001. What people studying this regionally and as nearby as Portland have found is that where new housing, and again, these are small housing units, is going to be added is on available, you know, areas that are underutilized by the owner of that site. So these are going to be small, these are going to be ADUs, and they're going to be, you know, a detached duplex on the back of a lot that has an existing home. They may be an addition to the home that is a separate unit that creates, you know, intergenerational housing or a co-housing circumstance based on the actual analysis of what is feasible, right? Meaning that people who are building the housing don't want to go out of business building it and are not philanthropic in their efforts, meaning like they can just dump $1 million into it and not have to deal with the repercussions of that with their pro forma. What we're going to see is small infill, and that's going to be the case for some time. In some cases, we will, you know, eventually see some of the, you know, plex, triplex, or quad infill. What we're not going to see is habitable housing torn down to build middle housing. Why? Because if there is a unit of housing on a lot that can currently be lived in or rented, it's an incredibly valuable asset. And it's going to continue to be an invaluable asset. And so it's not going to go away. People who are looking to add housing are going to add it in some other way. And I think that's everything.
Thank you. Thank you. Our time is more than up.
Oh gosh, it's wonderful to be here.
Well, thank you. We record these and they will be available to people who couldn't stay on. And I hope they do tune in because you've given some very valuable answers to our concerned people. We've learned so much, Karen. I'm so sorry.
Oh,
it's been an honor to have you speak, and I'm sure we all appreciate what you've done in the community as well. To the rest of our audience, we hope to see y'all back here in February. Stay tuned, read the newsletter, Argus, check your email. We don't send very much. And look at our website for current events, calls to action, and a treasure trove of our league's work, past and present. Stay safe and be well. Onward.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for staying long. I'm sure that you all have your next appointments to be getting to. And I think I have a meeting that I'm supposed to jump into right now as well. So I'll sign off. Chelsea, please let me know if follow-up information and for the Argus or other links. I'll try. I think I mentioned a few times in my presentation.
Yeah, the invisible class, the color of law, and the outreach by the numbers were the three that I noted that would be valuable to have.
Okay.
So,
what I'll do is I'll put together a short email or a Word document that has hyperlinks and send it to you all, and then you can use it however you see fit.
that would be nice to have it before too long. I work on the Argus Saturday and Sunday. So
Oh, okay. So tomorrow?
Tomorrow would be wonderful.
Okay. I will do my very best to get that to you tomorrow.
So appreciate it.
Of course.
This is a very important topic to the league. We've been working with it, as you know,
Yes.
quite a while, and trying to help dispel rumors.
There's so much complexity, and there's certainly ample opportunity for fear mongering and misinformation. I sent a hopefully diplomatic but pretty direct email to Terry earlier saying, there's a lot of what we are dealing with right now is that these strategies have worked before to just, misinform and whip up fear and have it be a technical conversation, and then everything comes crashing down. And
innuendo and rumor and misinformation.
It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, I'm a former building official, and I'm on the Lane County Planning Commission. And when we were talking within the league about the ADUs, everybody had this, or not everybody, many had horrible, what they thought was horrible scenarios, which would be allowed now, would have been allowed before ADUs, So, what if they build one that can see down into my property? Well, that can happen now. And
the buildable envelope for a single unit home is much larger than people realize. All of the development standards related to middle housing are they can't be more onerous than what we apply to our single family homes. So when people are saying, can you believe they would allow this? It's like, we already do.
Yep, we already do.